Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special Azure Hangout session on the Azure Application Gateway. So this is a particular topic that I've been putting back for a while now, and thanks to Len Vogue for requesting this. So Len, if you're watching this and this video recording is for you, hope you enjoy it, and I hope others enjoy this recording also. So what are we going to be covering today? So here's the agenda. We're going to be covering how the Azure Application Gateway works. So what exactly is the Azure Application Gateway? Let's try to understand this service provided by Microsoft. And then what we'll start doing is we'll start delving into some of the architectural concepts and components of this service. So we'll talk about scalability and availability considerations. We'll talk about what to look out for when you're thinking about performance and security when it comes to this service. Of course, any conversation about the public cloud has to include conversation around cost and pricing. So we'll talk about that. We'll also have some discussion around support and SLA. I'll talk about how you could integrate something like the Surface XG firewall in terms of the IPS integration. So I was hoping I was going to do a demo, but in trying to cut short the video, not to make things too long, I'll probably do the demo as a separate video. So I expect the demo as a separate video on that, but I'll talk about it in this particular session too. Um, so as part of that, I'll cover some things around limitations what the Azure Application Gateway cannot do. So for example, when you think about the security component or capabilities of it, it doesn't have anything that has to do with like antivirus scanning, anything that has to do with IPS IDS, which is where like a solution like the Sophos XG firewall can come in to kind of like augment this particular service and its capabilities if you're using that. So of course there are different architecture of using the XG itself as a standalone solution. But again, those are things that we'll get into in other videos. And of course, throughout the whole presentation, I'll be throwing in certain demonstrations to help us in our awareness of this service. So enough talking, let's get into this. So let's start by looking at a quick overview of this Azure Application Gateway service. So the Azure Application Gateway is considered to be a type of a load balancer in Azure. So in Azure, there are different load balancing services, network load balancing services that are available, and they have different purposes, different limitations, different aspects in which you can align them to. So for example, you take something like the Azure Application Gateway, it's what you consider either an internal or a regional category when you talk about load balancers in Azure. When you talk about something like Traffic Manager, that's it's kind of like in the global category along with this new service provided by Microsoft called Azure Front Door, which does content acceleration. But focusing back on Azure Application Gateway, so you consider it as a type of load balancer or a load balancing solution in Azure. It does application delivery. It can do modern application delivery. It can do web application firewall and provide OWASP top 10 protection. That's sort of like to the extent of what it does when it comes to security, really. Um, but again, we'll get into some of this. I don't want to go ahead of myself. So Azure Application Gateway, load balancing solution in Azure, considered to be kind of like regional or internal category. Um, Good thing about it is when you look at like some of these other solutions, like the the standard load balancer or the basic load balancer, that supports any protocol in Azure. So could be TCP, could be UDP, any protocol that comes into that, as long as you can create the rule for it. If you can't create the rule, if you're using something like standard load balancer that support HA ports, you could distribute any protocol. But Azure Application Gateway is one that's unique in the sense that you can only use it for HTTP, HTTPS, or web services. So any traffic that supports HTTP, HTTPS is what you can really use it for. And again, it's because it has special capabilities for that type of service, for those type of web services. So Azure Application Gateway, one of the things that makes it unique versus the standard or basic load balancer, it because it understands the HTTP and HTTPS protocol. And what that means is that we can do more advanced application delivery scenarios beyond what we can do with the standard or basic load balancer. So I'll give you an illustration as we go on. So one illustration is if traffic comes to the load balancer and the URL path is maybe www.mywebsite.com/images. I want to send that to a separate backend pool. Therefore, I want to make application delivery decisions based on an HTTP header. Standard or basic load balancer does not read up to that level. So it only goes up to layer 3, layer 4. So it has no understanding of what's going on that layer 7. Therefore, it cannot do application delivery based on information that's contained in that layer. But the Azure Application Gateway can, because again, it understands and speaks HTTP, HTTPS. Okay, moving on. Here's a kind of like, again, a repeat of what I just discussed in terms of that. So, again, this just emphasizing that it's kind of like regional or internal, and then it's mainly around web applications. Let's move on. Let's kind of like understand a bit of history to this. So the service itself became GA on the Azure platform around June of 2015. So that was when the service became GA. And when it got to around September in 2016, so a little bit more than a year later, the web application firewall component was battered in that. So that's kind of like became preview then. So when it first became GA, it was mainly just application delivery. But then WAF came in September 2016. And then the WAF component became GA in around March 2017. Um, so there used to be like an Azure App Gateway classic access that you can access to the classic portal. So that was removed in October of 2017. Um, just much more recently in September 2018, I think that was just roughly after Microsoft Ignite. The Azure Application Gateway auto scaling was announced in preview, so that's kind of like as part of like the V2 the V2 series of the Azure Application Gateway, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then just much more recently, 20, no, so that's not correct. So let's fix that. Let's fix that date. So that was probably 30/04. So let's go ahead and fix that. So there we go. That looks better now. So 30/04 2018, the Azure Application Gateway Standard version 2 and WAF version 2 became GA. All this will make sense as we go on. So let's talk very quickly about the first thing I want you to understand and learn about the Azure Application Gateway. Having understood that overview, first thing I want you to understand and learn about it is number one, the Azure Application Gateway has two tiers and two SKUs. So if I were to try to deploy an Azure Application Gateway, one of the things that I will need to select, one of the core things that I will need to select will be what tier, and maybe not SKU is not the right word, let's say two versions. So two tiers, two versions. I'll need to select the tier that I want, and I'll need to select the version that I want. So there are two tiers. So let's talk about the tiers. There's the standard tier and there's the WAF tier. Think about the standard tier as having just application delivery capabilities. So it can do things like SSL offloading, components like maybe even URL rewriting, another component like that, right? Site path routing or URL path routing. So it can do those kind of capabilities are included as part of like the standard tier. But then if you want like that OWASP stop them protection against the types of vulnerability and exploits that we see with web applications, the WAF tier combines both application delivery capabilities, so it has the capabilities that the standard has, alongside with web application firewall capabilities. And web application firewall capabilities, I don't want you to now go crazy in your thinking to think While this covers like every single thing that you have to do with web application firewall. It's mainly when it comes to security components, talking about the OWASP top 10 um, security rule sets. So that's like the main focus, and we'll get into that when we start looking into this in a bit more detail. So those are the two tiers: standard and web application firewall tier. Then we have two versions. So which is let's go versions, which I will just call for now. I'll say version 1 and version 2. So what that means, to make it more simple, is that whenever we want to deploy an Azure Application Gateway, we will need to select. We have four options to select from. We can either select standard V1. Now Microsoft don't refer to this as V1 when you look in the Azure portal. It's just simply referred to as standard. You can select WAF. I'll call it V1. So again, not referred to as V1. If you look in the portal, just referred to as WAF. But also we have a standard V2 and we have a WAF V2. So that's referring to the tier, that's referring to the version. So David, why did you spend a lot of effort going into all of this? Well, it's very simple. Whatever SKU that you select, so all of this, I'll refer to this as kind of like the SKUs. Whatever SKU that you select of the Azure Application Gateway, that's going to determine the capabilities that you can use. So it has big importance here in terms of what we're talking about, and some of these we'll go into. So one thing I'll do is let's go to over here very quickly. Let's get some notes up. So whatever skill you select in terms of the tier or the version that you select, that has an impact in what capabilities can you use. So for example, if you want the OWASP top 10 protection in terms of the OWASP core rule set, you've got to select the WAF tier, right? So another thing could be, what about if you want auto scaling, which we'll talk about. If you want auto scaling, well, you've got to select version 2. So standard version 2, WAF version 2 supports auto scaling, but version 1, either standard or WAF, does not support auto scaling. What else is not supported? There's a lot of stuff that's not supported. Another one is static virtual IP. So if you want to be able to have a static reserved virtual IP address for your application gateway, you've got to select version 2 because those are not available in version 1. So whatever skill, whatever tier or version that you select determines the capabilities that you have access to. So whatever skill, which is referring to a combination of tier and version, just select, determines the capabilities available to you. And when we start talking about the capabilities, let's look very quickly at some of the capabilities of this. So that's covered as we go on into this presentation. So what I'll do is I'll go back to the slides and then we can look at an example of what I just talked about. So for example, we have a tier, standard and WAF. Standard tier has only application delivery capabilities, while the WAF tier has both application delivery and web application firewall capabilities. And then we have two versions. Um, version 2, well, was in preview, but it's no longer in preview, so it's now GA'd now. So actually, let's go ahead and fix this slide. So I like this because we're fixing stuff as we go. And again, anybody that's familiar with public cloud platforms like Azure would know that things change very quickly. So, things change very quickly. So essentially, we've got to keep ourselves updated with what's going on. So version 2 is now GA as at 30th of April 2019. So there's still limitations in terms of the regions that's available, but that's going to roll out globally as time goes on. So in terms of the capabilities that's available, here are the capabilities in terms of talking about that. So you have the version 1 and you have the version 2 skill. So you have auto scaling capabilities only available in version 2. Things like zone redundancy. If you do not have an understanding of what availability zones are, go watch the Azure Hangout series that we put out on the Azure Global Infrastructure. That will give you an understanding of that. So static virtual IP, that's only available in version 2. So things like rewrite HTTP header, so that's not available in version 1, only available in version 2. Things like the Azure Kubernetes Services Ingress Controller, only available in version 2. But you can see all the other ones. So, and again, this is just going into a bit more details with what we talked about. So, like reserved standard virtual IP, zonal resiliency across availability zones. So the static virtual IP. In fact, the key vault integration, those are available in standard version 2. Auto scaling, better performance, faster provisioning and configuration time. That's available only for version 2. The ingress controller for Azure Kubernetes services. So being able to use Application Gateway to deliver traffic to your backend application that you're hosting as pods on Azure Kubernetes services. That's available again in version 2. So what I'll do now is I'll skip a bunch of like all these other conversation. Let's actually go ahead and let's try to do a quick demo. And one of the quick demos that we'll try to do is we'll try to deploy an Azure Application Gateway into a virtual network in Azure. So let's draw a quick diagram of what we have and what we're building here. So what we're going to start off with is we're going to start off with an Azure Virtual Network. So within this Azure Virtual Network, I have some current services that I'm hosting. So for example, I have 2 web servers. So let's get this diagram up on the screen for us. Let's go to web servers, and I'm hosting my web servers in West Europe region. So these web servers exist kind of like in their own subnets over here. So we'll just draw that this way. And what I want to do is I want to deliver an Azure Application Gateway. I want to deploy an Azure Application Gateway to be able to deliver traffic to this backend web servers that are hosting in Azure. One of the first things that we need to know is that an Azure Application Gateway can only be deployed within a virtual network in Azure. So it's not like one of these services that does not exist within the virtual network. This particular service, even though it's a managed service, it exists within a virtual network. So whether you're deploying it as an external load balancer or as an internal load balancer, it always lives within a virtual network. And one of the things that we'll first of all need to do is we'll need to create a subnet. And this subnet has to be empty. We cannot deploy an Azure Application Gateway into a subnet that currently contains other resources in Azure. So first of all, we need to create an empty subnet. And once we create an empty subnet, then we can go ahead and deploy our application gateway into that empty subnet within our virtual network. So hopefully that makes sense. So let's go ahead and get that done. So here I am. If I go under virtual machines, you see a bunch of virtual machines that I have hosted and running in West Europe, across in different resource groups and some in UK South, but I'm mainly focusing on the West Europe ones. So what I'll do is if I go on the create a resource, and in the marketplace, if I search for application, and you have application gateway here, if I click on that, and I can click on create, and that takes me into where I can create the Azure Application Gateway. I'll just make this a bit bigger so you can see the screen. So I'll call this West Europe Application Gateway 01. So here's the tier that I was talking about. We can select standard, standard v2, WAF, WAF v2. We'll come to this later, right? So just a few moments, we'll come back to this. So I'll deploy this into an existing resource group that I have into the West Europe resource group. That's fine. And I'll select the location to be West Europe. Notice that our virtual network and our public IP address must be in the same location as the gateway. So that goes without saying. I mean, that makes logical sense. So I'm not going to be doing a full deployment of this because I'm going to be talking about the other design points in a minute. But I want to show you very quickly what that looks like. So if I go on the subnet over here, if I go ahead and select my virtual network, So one of the things that you notice is I cannot select my West Europe virtual network. And the reason why it says why I can't select it is because I do not have a subnet that's empty that I can deploy the gateway into. So the first thing I'll need to do is I'll need to go under virtual networks. I'll need to go to my virtual network over here. And what I'll do is I'll go under subnet and I'll create a new subnet. And I'll leave that IP address range. I'll call this app gateway subnet. I'll leave all the settings as the default. I'll go ahead and click OK to that. And when I click OK to that, it's created my subnet now. So now I can go under create a resource. If I type in application gateway again and go through the same process that I did earlier now. So if I do West Europe app gateway 01, select my resource group, right, and click OK to that. Now, if I go under virtual network, now I can select my virtual network because I have an empty subnet in there. So if I click on that, and now it automatically selected the subnet that I created now. So that's kind of like the way it works. It has to be deployed within a virtual network. And here I can specify if I want it to be public or if I want it to be private. So that's where I can specify that. Okay, so let's move on because I'm not doing the deployment. I just wanted to point that out to you. Let's talk about some information about the application gateway. And what I'll do is I'll go back to the Azure portal and I'll talk to this as I go over it. So let's close this. Let's go back on the basic settings and let's talk about this. So we've already talked about the tiers. For now, if I select WAF v2 just because it contains all the functionalities, right? You can see that I can select either manual, I can select auto scaling, right? So again, we'll talk to some of this in a minute. One of the things that you notice, for example, if I select something like standard, is you notice I can select an instance count. So here's the way Azure Gateway, Azure Application Gateway, the service is how it operates. If we're selecting something like the standard v1 or the WAF v1, we can specify the number of instances that we want this gateway to be running. So those instances are the actual one doing like the processing that of what's going through. But we can specify the amount that we want. So this kind of like the visualization of what that looks like. So we can specify our instances. So what I'll do also is I'll go get a diagram to make things a bit easier for us. So Azure Application Gateway Service is what I'm deploying. And my Application Gateway Service, actually, let's go do ourselves a bit of a favor here and let's drag things a bit around so we can get the diagram over here. So Azure Application Gateway, we can specify the number of instances that we want. So if we're selecting standard or WAF skills, and those instances do the actual processing. But also, these instances will have listeners. And the listeners are kind of like what does traffic processing. Again, all of this will make more sense as we move on to talk about all the other components. So if I do www.mike.xyz, www.suzy.xyz. So let's leave this here. Let's move on and I'll come back to this because I think it's going to make more sense as we cover some other information. So what I'll do is I'm conscious of time here a bit. So what I'll do is I'll skip forward and I'll go to talk about some of the design consideration of the Azure Application Gateway. So first thing that we'll talk about is I will talk about scalability. So when we talk about the Azure Application Gateway and the scalability um, considerations, the first thing is that we can have up to 1,000 application gateways per subscription. So if I have an Azure subscription, I can have up to 1,000 application gateways in there. Each application gateway can have up to 200 instances for version 2 or 75 instances for version 1. Now, these numbers I didn't get this from an official Microsoft document, just from testing and practicing. That's where I got this number from. So do not take that as kind of like the gospel. So the reason why I said that is if I go over here and if I go to Azure subscription limit and I go to the document that contains Azure subscription limit. If I scroll down and I go to application gateway, you can see that it says I can have up to 1000 application gateways, but under instances, and it says the following table applies to version 1, version 2, standard, and WAF skills. It says I can have up to 32 instances per gateway. Again, remember our diagram. The instances are doing the processing. So I can have up to 32 is what the document says. But the document doesn't seem to have been updated because this doesn't look accurate. Either the document is not accurate or I'm misinterpreting something. Because if I go over here where I can specify my instance count, if I go on the standard, of course I can specify 32, but if I go ahead and specify 75, it allows me to. Now, if I go ahead and specify 76, then it complains and it says you can only go up to 75. But I can have 75 instances on the standard V1. And it's the same goes if I go under WAF V1, I can have up to 75 instances. If I go for standard V2 and I set this to manual, right, instead of auto scale, and for my instance count, if I go 200, it allows me to do that. Now, if I go 201, I get an error, but it allows me to go up to 200. So what I'm saying is this document doesn't seem to have been updated, but just keep that in mind when it comes to scalability in terms of what we're having in a diagram. For version 1, we can go up to 75 instances. For version 2, we can go up to 200 instances within an application gateway service. So keep that in mind. So what else do we have to consider? So each application gateway can consist of 100 HTTP listeners. And think about the listeners as kind of like your website. So we don't need one application gateway per website. We can actually have multiple websites or multiple domains or multiple subdomains hosted under the same service. And that's the reason why on the listeners here, I started writing out different domain names and different website names and stuff like that because application gateway can have up to 100 of these and again up to 200 or 75 of the instances. So so for example, I can have this as maybe multiple different domain names and different websites and web services, and that could even be subdomains on that one domain, and I can have up to 100 of those for a single application gateway. I can have one site per HTTP listener. That makes sense. That means I can have up to 100 websites per application gateway. And if I'm using HTTPS, I can have only one SSL certificate per HTTP listeners, which means up to 100 maximum. All of that makes sense. So what about scalability? How does application gateway support scalability in other ways beyond what we just talked about? So application gateway supports scalability. If you're using version 1, you have to add multiple instances to your gateway. So if I'm using version 1, I am responsible for scaling this. So that means I have to have monitoring in place to ensure that if these two instances are reaching their capacity, I have to ensure that I had another or more instances to be able to handle the load. So I have to handle the scaling. So that's for version 1. So keep that in mind. So again, that's why I put in my slide over here and I said, as a customer for version 1, you have more responsibility for scalability because you have to monitor and you have to add more instances to handle the load when needed. When you're adding more instances, there's no downtime incurred. So application gateway is good in that. We'll talk about that when we talk about availability. For version 2 automatically ensures that new instances are added provided you select the auto scaling option. So if I go for version 2, if I select the manual option, I have the same responsibility as version 1. But if I go for version 2, in this case, if I go back to this, if I go for version 2, what version 2, I can select manual, in which case I have to add multiple instances and I have to be responsible for that in terms of scale. But I can also change this to auto scale. So first thing I'll need to do is if I need to clear this so we don't get error messages. So let's go to, right? So that's auto scaling. If I go to, if I select this, and I specify a minimum of 2 instances, maximum of 20 instances. What that means is that if the load increases, Azure Application Gateway Service can automatically add instances for me up to the 20 number. So that's the auto scaling. But that's only available for version 2. Let's move on very quickly here because of time. Um, so, what's the name? Increased outbound connectivity. So we can have multiple front ends, in other words, multiple IP addresses that associated with the application gateway. So that can help us to increase outbound flow. So that's talking about things like TCP port extortion. But again, that's not more of like an issue these days. But just to know that that's possible to have multiple IP addresses or public IP addresses in associated with your application gateway to do that, to have more outbound flows. Okay, so I've already showed you some of the things about scalability. Let's move very quickly to talk about availability. So when it comes to availability of the application gateway, again, for version 1, the customer has more responsibility. When we talk about availability, if you're using version 1, you are responsible for ensuring that you do not deploy this with one instance. Because if you deploy this with one instance, then essentially that's a single point of failure. You are responsible for when you're deploying it to select a minimum of 2 instances. So keep that in mind. Now, when you had 2 instances, what Microsoft Azure will do is ensure that the instances are spread across fault domains and update domains. If you don't understand what those mean, go over to the video that we did on Azure Global Infrastructure. It will make more sense to you. But Azure will ensure that they are spread across fault and update domains. And there's no downtime when you're adding more instances. So what about for version 2? Let's talk about this very quickly. For version 2, Microsoft Azure automatically ensures that new instances are spread across fault domains and update domains. What does that mean? If I select the auto scaling capability of Azure Application Gateway version 2, Azure will ensure that the new instances that are added are spread across fault domains and update domains. And if I have zone redundancy configured also, so if I have zone redundancy, which if I select a region that supports availability zones, Azure will ensure that they are spread across availability zones to offer zonal failure resiliency. So it's still recommended to have a minimum of 2 instances to avoid downtime. So even if you're selecting version 2, so for example, if I'm selecting version 2 and I put this to manual, if I go ahead and select one over there, it's not going to allow me. It's going to say I have to have a minimum of 2. And what Microsoft will do is I can specify the zones and Microsoft will ensure that the instances are spread across the availability zones. So let's move on again very quickly. Let's talk about some of the other points. So when it comes to the public IP address that's associated with the application gateway, or essentially the endpoint IP address associated with the application gateway, for version 1, that can be dynamic. So if the application gateway for some reason restarts or stops and started again, the DNS name can change. But again, that's very easy to get around. Just ensure that you point your website to the CNAME so that because sorry, you create a CNAME record in your DNS and you point your website to the DNS name of the IP address, and the DNS name gets updated if the IP address changes. For version 2, you can select a static virtual IP address, which essentially gives you, that peace of mind that the IP is not going to change. So what that essentially is talking about is for this Azure Application Gateway, there's a public IP. So let's go public IP. And for version 1, this public IP address is dynamic, so which means if this starts or restarts, this public IP address can change. But for version 2, we can have this set to static IP address. So when it comes to availability SLA that's available for application gateway in Azure, provided that you have two or more medium or larger instances, there is an availability SLA of 99.95%. Provided again that you have two or more medium or larger instances. We'll talk about this when we get to performance. If you select two small instances, if you're using the version 1 versions or SKUs of the Azure Application Gateway, you have no SLA. So keep that in mind. What do we mean if I go back to the Azure portal? If I go ahead and select version 1 here, I can select a SKU size. Even if I have two instances running, if I select small, I do not get an availability SLA. For me to get an availability SLA, this must be a minimum of two instances, and I must have this set to either medium or large. I cannot have one instance that's medium, I do not get an availability SLA. I cannot select one instance and large, I do not get an availability SLA. So keep that in mind. We have to have a minimum of two, and the SKU size has to be medium or large. That's for version 1. So that either standard or WAF tier, that's for version 1. For version 2, we'll talk about that again. One thing you notice is that there's only one size essentially. We can't select a size because there's only one size. But we'll cover that when we get to performance. Okay, let's move on very quickly. There's a lot of stuff that, that we're trying to cover within such a short amount of time that I've got to be a bit careful here. So let's go application gateway. 1 minute. Let's bring up some more information. Okay, so what I'll do now is if I go back to this and let's talk about performance next. What about performance? What do we need um, to keep in mind? When it comes to performance, I showed you just right now for version 1 that we can select the application gateway instance sizes for version 1. So if we're using version 1, we have this option to select the instance sizes. And these are the numbers published by Microsoft when it comes to the instance sizes for version 1. Remember, version 2 only has one instance size, so we cannot change the instance size. So here's the performance that's associated with each size. So for small, you have 7.5 or 35 megabits per second. Again, it depends on what your backend page size. So this is what this result or this information is based on, and you can see that here. So for large, you can have either 50 megabits per second, or you can go up to 200 megabits per second. But one thing that I want you to note is this information from Microsoft when it comes to these numbers. These numbers are not guaranteed values, they are approximate values for an application gateway throughput. And the actual throughput that you will get, it depends on a lot of different combinations. I see this a lot, like when I work with different people, that people just assume that performance within a public cloud environment is kind of, because it's not an environment that you can control the same way you can control environments on premises. So there's a lot of variables that goes into performance architecture in the public cloud. So you have to consider things like your average page size, things like what's the location of your backend instances, what's the processing time that it takes to serve the pages. If I'm serving just an HTML based text web page, it's going to take a different, it's going to have different performance result versus if I'm loading a web page that has multiple referrals and multiple videos and images and stuff that's built into that. So keep that in mind. So for exact performance numbers, recommendation is you should always run your own tests. For version 2, the application gateway instance is currently offered in only one size, so we can't select our sizes, we just select the number of instances that we want. I'm yet to see the numbers when it comes to that, so in case anybody has that, please feel free to share that in the description below, or go to my LinkedIn and share that with me, and I'll be happy to update that information. Let's talk a bit about, actually, let me go back to the screen and let me show you what I mean by the performance. If I go to version 1, I can select the sizes. based on the numbers that you saw for guidance. If I select version 2, you notice I cannot select the sizes, it's only in one size. Um, okay, let's move on to security. Let's talk about security. Um, I'll skip a bunch of this because of time. But again, you can pause and read this information. So NHGs can be used to lock down connectivity to your to your application gateway on that subnet. But you've got to be a bit careful. So you must add exceptions for this port for version 1 and for this port for version 2. So this is because remember the application gateway is a managed service. So what that means is I can have a network security group. So let me go get a network security group icon over here very quickly. Let's go network security group icon. Let's get that. Oh, let's go. Here we go. So can I have a network security group? I've got to do this very carefully because this is a managed service. This is not a service that I manage myself. It's deployed within my virtual network. Microsoft needs to be able to manage this service, and therefore I must enable certain ports for the communication to be able to work. Otherwise, I may run into other issues. So that's what that is talking about. So keep in mind if you're going to be using that, keep in mind to use it in a bit more careful and tactful way. And if you're going to be doing that, you have to expose certain ports. So you have to export this port ranges for version 1 and this port ranges for version 2. So if people are concerned about, yeah, what happens? I'm opening this port and all the stuff. So these port ranges are required for the Azure infrastructure to be able to communicate with the application gateway. And this communication over this port are protected and locked down by Azure certificate. So except the communication can be verified with certificates that are validated by the Azure platform itself without the proper certificate external entities, including the customers of those gateway, you cannot initiate any changes on those endpoints. So essentially, that's like really, really locked down communication that can only happen on those ports. But remember to open those ports. When it comes to outbound internet connectivity, you can't block that. Traffic from the Azure Load Balancer tag must be allowed on the backend system. So what that means is on my backend systems, if I'm going to be having a network security group associated to the subnet or the network interfaces, I have to ensure that I allow the Azure Load Balancer service tag so that communication from the load balancer to the backend instances can work. So things like the health probe and stuff. If you don't do that, you run into other issues. So keep those in mind in trying to get security. Do not break the functionality of the solution is what we're talking about. Keep that in mind. Let me show you very quickly what I mean. So I'll leave this over here. I'll go quickly to portal.azure.com because I want to show you that service tag of the Azure Application Gateway. If I go on the network security groups over here and go select an existing network security group for one of my backend servers, and if I go to on the inbound security rule, you notice that there's a default inbound security rule for Azure Load Balancer inbound. Be careful not to put a deny rule above that particular rule. So be careful, do not put a deny rule above because then everything gets denied before it gets to this. So if you're going to have a deny rule, ensure that maybe you create a new rule and then what's the name? You select maybe your service tag and you ensure that you have your service tag associated with the Azure the Azure load balancer service tag essentially. So keep those in mind. So this is a bit slow for me, yeah, but it's going to respond in a minute and you have Azure load balancer service tag and then you allow that. Okay, so let's move on very quickly. What else do I want to talk about? Let's talk about monitoring and then I'll talk about some of the other components again. So when it comes to monitoring of Azure Application Gateway, let's talk about that very quickly. Um, Actually, before I talk about monitoring, let's do some more quick deployment. So what I'll do is I'll quickly go back to my deployment of what I'm doing. I'll select WAF. I'll go ahead and complete this deployment. So I'll select WAF. I'll select manual and I'll select two instances. to deploy, leave it in the resource group. I'll spread this across the availability zones. I'll click OK to that. So, because I want to complete this process. So for virtual network, I'll select my virtual network and I'll deploy it into the empty subnet I created earlier. Gonna give it a public IP address. Now, because I'm using version 2, I can make this a static public IP address. I can have a DNS name, which I'll call DO App Gateway 01. Hopefully that's available. That's not available. So let's do DO West Europe App Gateway 01. So that's available. That's all good. So what I'll do is I'll copy this name and I'll make a note of that. West Europe cloud app. So let's go here. That's good. Okay, so let's go back to this. I've got all this all done. And again, you see that it's automatically selected static because I'm using version 2. So the ports that I want, so it's giving me the option to configure my listener. I'm going to select just HTTP now. Of course, if I select HTTP, yes, I'll need to upload my PFX certificate file. But for now, I'll just select HTTP. I can enable or disable HTTP version 2, which gets more performance or better performance. I can enable or disable the web application firewall capabilities of this gateway because I'm selecting the WAF tier, WAF version 2. So I'll leave that enabled. Do I want the firewall to operate in detection mode? In other words, just log whatever is detected, but don't block it. Or do I want it to operate in prevention mode? I'll set it to prevention mode here, and I'll go ahead and click OK. And I click OK to that, and then what I'll do is if I go ahead and click OK, so it's going to begin the deployment of my application gateway. So that's going to start. If I go over here, it's going to say deployment in progress. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and pause the recording for now. So I will come back and I'll pick up from here. I don't want to go for too long because it's getting close to 50 minutes now. So when we come back, I'll cover some quick information about monitoring of the Azure Application Gateway. And I think we'll just call it a day there. Then what I'll do is I'll create other videos as kind of like to fill in some of the information that I skipped over here. So see you in a few minutes. Okay, welcome back. So the deployment completed already. So if I go on the application gateways over here, so you can see my application gateway. So one of the things that if you're familiar with load balancing that you notice that I've not yet configured is the health probe. So one of the things is I don't actually need to configure an health probe. I can, and I'll show you very quickly where you do that. But once I create like an HTTP listener and I specify my backend. So once I specify my backend to the application gateway service, it's going to automatically do a default probe to the backend based on whatever configuration that I've used. Now I can go ahead and use a custom probe if I wanted to, but by default there's a out probe that goes to these backend instances once I had this as a backend probe. So what I'll do is if I go back to under this, let's go do some basic configuration. So if I go on the backend pool and I'll go to add my backend pool. So it automatically added the default one, but what I'll do is I'll go change this. Now the server that I'm hosted is called DVWA, which is kind of like an application that all security people will use for pen testing practice or basic pen testing practice. So I'll call this DVWA pool, and that'll be based on virtual machines that I'm hosting. So you can see here that I can point to a service that's not necessarily hosted in Azure. So that could be a service hosted on premises. I can point to a virtual machine scale out, or even Azure App Service. So I'll select virtual machine for now, and I'll go ahead and select my virtual machines I'm hosting in that region. So that virtual machine and the other virtual machine. So once I've added this, I go ahead and click add. That's going to add my backend pool. Web application firewall, of course, that's where I configure my firewall capabilities. So do I want it to operate as a firewall? Yes. Do I want it to be enabled or disabled? Yes, enabled. Do I want it to detect and just log, or do I want it to prevent? I want it to prevent, so I can select that. If I want to add certain exclusions, I can add that. If I want to scan the body of my pages, I can go ahead and add those there. On the rules is where I can specify, do I want the OWASP 3.0 core rule set, or do I want the OWASP 2.2.9 core rule set? And the main difference when I think about these two depends on kind of like the mode of detection. So it's going to be something called an anomaly mode or a traditional mode. An anomaly mode is the default of OWASP 3.0, which essentially is going to give a score, and it's going to go anything that's critical. A critical rule is a score of 5. Kind of like a high rule, I think, is a score of 3. So, for example, anything that's 5 and above is what gets blocked. Anything that's below 5, it's not blocked. It's going to be logged. So, what that means is if there's like only one I alert that's like triggered, that gives it a score of 3. That's not going to trigger a block. So that's kind of like the method that uses for OWASP 3.0. It's called anomaly mode. So that's where you can specify that. If I go under HTTP settings over here, because I'll just leave all the default settings. Under HTTP settings, there's a default setting over here that's using HTTP. And if I show you what that default setting is using, do I want to use cookie-based affinity? And cookie-based affinity is talking about if the session state is stored on my backend servers, and I want to always ensure that traffic, maybe there's a connection that's initiated and it's been sent to this backend server, that always goes to that backend server, so I can maintain the session state that's maintained in the cookie. So then I can use like cookie-based affinity to keep that affinity going. Um, so yeah, it's great. You can see, do I want the protocol to be HTTP, HTTPS? Do I want to use connection draining, and all this other stuff? So this is where I can specify, for example, if I wanted to not use the default probe, if I wanted to use a custom probe, this is where I can specify that, and I will need to create a custom probe that I want to use. But by default, that's a probe that goes on to the backend instances. If I go on the listeners, there's a default HTTP listener that is created for me, and that's associated with this role. I can configure custom error pages if I wanted to, and I can also disable or enable certain SSL versions. So this comes under the category of security. So when you talk about security, not all SSL is good SSL. So typically in the industry, just to let you know, so things like TLS version 1 and even TLS version 1.1 are not considered the best. So they actually have certain vulnerabilities like Beast, and some other vulnerabilities to them. And also in terms of the protocols that they use, so MD5 and SHA-1. So something like PCI DSS requires something like TLS version 1.2 at least. So what that means is that you may need to go here and you may need to go define what TLS version that you want to allow, what TLS version you don't want to allow. So for now, I'll just leave that set to the default because I'm not using that. And of course, you can add multiple listeners, and I'll just select the multi-site option. Under the rules is where I configure my rule. So this is what I'm actually going to be focusing on. So what I'll do is I'll create a new rule and I'll call it my DVWA rule. I'll select, I'll go create a listener first of all. Let's go do that very quickly. So add a new listener. I'll call this DVWA. Listener. That's my front-end IP. That's the front-end part. The host name that I want this to be, I'll just go select this name. So I'll select that name and I'll go put that name in there. Protocol HTTP. I can create like custom error pages if I wanted to. So maybe if I'm storing a custom error page for either 403 or 502, I can point to the URL there. So if I go ahead and click OK, that's going to add my listener. And now I should be able to add my rule. So if I go ahead and create a new rule, I'll call it DVWA rule. I have my listener selected. I'll select, so my backend pool, which I created earlier, but I cannot see here yet. So maybe it's still hiding that. Let's go have a look. So let's go to backend pool. Oh, for some reason it's not displaying yet. So I'll go add my backend pool again. Let's add the backend pool again. Click add. So with my backend targets, so hopefully both the targets get added. So essentially the main things that I need to do is I need to add my backend pool, I need to configure my listener, and I need to configure my rules. So those are the main things that I need to do. So backend pool, listeners, and rules are the core things that I need. I can always configure the others to do some customization. So if I go back on the rules, let's go add a new rule, DVWA rule, and let me make sure my backend pool is there now, and my listener is there, and I can use the default HTTP setting. So if I go ahead and click OK to that, it's like there's an error message, but let's toggle this. Yep, so I guess the reason for this is because it's probably still had in my backend pool, would be my guess. So something is still going on. And yep, it's indeed still had in my backend pool. So what I'll do is I'll just pause the recording. Once the backend pool has successfully been added, then I'll go ahead and complete the addition of my row, and then we can test. Oh, okay, actually, that's all done now. So let's go back to Application Gateway. Finally, this time, we'll get this done now. So if I go on the row, and I had my row, DVWA row, and I select my listener, and I go to DVWA pool, and I select the HTTP setting, I click OK to that. So that should be successful this time around. So let's make sure that that's good. So once that is good, what I should be able to do is go to that URL, and that should take me to my backend server or my backend services. Then I'll conclude by talking about monitoring, and then I'll stop for now. So that's saved. Let's go open a new browser. Let's do a paste and go. And there we go. I'm getting to my backend service now. And I should be able to log into that and go, and I can access my, let's try that again. Oh, something is broken on my backend. Oh, yeah, that's fine. So I'll just move on to talk about monitoring, and then we can carry on for now. Okay. So the other thing that I'll also do is if I go back here, actually, let's go modify the HTTP setting, and I'll enable cookie-based affinity. So I'll leave that. I'll go ahead and click save. So I'll just do that. Okay. So now let's talk about monitoring, and then I can move on. So whenever we talk about monitoring, with anything in Azure, if we have a conversation about monitoring, we're mainly going to be talking about this service called Azure Monitor. And what Microsoft are doing, they're working so hard at this, is they're trying to centralize a lot of the monitoring capabilities of the Azure platform under this centralized service called Azure Monitor. Now, when we talk about Azure Monitor, there are two main data stores. There's the metric stores and there's the log store. Metric store contains information typically that's coming from the platform about the operations of our resources. So for example, what that will look like is if you're talking about a virtual machine, what's the percentage CPU usage, what's the disk read, what's the disk write, and all those information. Those are considered to be metrics, and those are collected from the Azure platform. You do not need to do anything to enable them. They're enabled by default. They are emitted typically every 1 minute, except otherwise stated. Now, when you talk about logs, you have two types of logs mainly. You're talking about activity log, which is defined talking about administrative actions. Who created this application gateway? Who modified this application gateway? Who modified this setting? All those are application, so on the management plane, right? All the kind of like calls that made to like the API. That's what that's referring to. So let's move on. And then after what's the name? Activity log, we have the diagnostic log. So let's actually go to the next slide. So you can see administrative logs are referring to administrative audit logs, so things that are done on the management plane. So these are collected by default. We do not need to enable these, and they are retained for 93 days. So if I go under my application gateway, if I go under activity log over here, I can see all the administrative changes that's been done, what was created, what was failed, who created and made those changes. I can see over there. So let me go enable my Azure mask back in a minute. So I can see all those changes over there. That's administrative log. Again, we don't need to enable anything. Now, when we talk about things like metrics, they are operational counters, again, from the Azure platform. There's no need to enable anything. They are collected by default. So for most metrics, they are emitted every 1 minute into Azure Monitor. So if I scroll down, if I go on the metrics over here, I'll be able to see the kind of metrics that I can get from the Azure Application Gateway. So things like my LD host count. So that's an important number. So right now I have one LD host count, which is not good because I'm expecting to have two. So because I have two backend services. So one of my hosts is not currently showing up as being LD. But those are the kind of information that you can get from here. Um, if I go on the things like on LD host count, it's currently showing nothing. So okay, that is showing one. So one of my hosts, one of my backend hosts seems to be on LD. So let's go have a look. Yeah, okay. So again, that's where you get those information from. And those are considered to be metrics. What are the failed requests that have come to this application gateway service? What are the success, what are the kind of like concurrent connections that's going on to this Azure application service? And I can even change the time range to what I want, the level of granularity, and I can see those information over here. So those are metrics. Diagnostic settings, on the other hand, are kind of like information about what's going on from within the resource. So that's what diagnostic logs are referring to. So that's talking about information from within the resource itself. Now, these ones are not enabled by default. Now, the first two, there's no extra charges for them. But for this one, which is kind of like the main important one, if you ask me, there's charges associated with them. So if I enable a diagnostic logs, for example, these are the three main logs talking about access information to the gateway, what's accessing what, all the different requests that come into the gateway, information about the performance of the gateway, and information about the firewall. So if there's a detection, if there's something that's logged, if there's something that's blocked, I won't be able to get that except I turn this on. And this is going to have additional costs to me. So because if I go to turn this on, for example, I have three options. I can either archive this to a storage account, in which case I can use another service to collect those logs for analysis. I can stream it to an event hub, which can use a SIM service or whatever other service to pick those up from the event hub. Or I can send this to log analytics, or what is now referred to as Azure Monitor Logs, and I can use a service like Azure Log Analytics to analyze those information. Any option I choose to go for, there's a cost associated to it, right? So be aware of that, that if you're using web application firewall of the Azure Application Gateway, it's not the same login that you may be used to on your typical web application firewall. So I'll just do app gateway dag logs over here, and I'll archive to a storage account, and I'll go to select a storage account. So I'll select this storage account, West Europe RGDAG. I'll click OK to that. So I'll select the logs that I want to collect, the access, the performance, and the firewall logs. How long do I want to retain them for? If I select 0, that means indefinite retention. So I'll go ahead and just select this for now. Now I'll go ahead and just click save. And just because I want to show you very quickly what those looks like. So, and then to show you that these logs are not things that are, as straightforward as something that you may be used to. So if I go under this, and if I go under blobs, I can see, what's the name? Insights logs, application gateway access log, firewall, and performance logs. Now, if I click on this, so for example, I click on the firewall one and show you what that looks like. Now have a look at what this looks like. I go on the subscription. I go on the select subscription, select resource group, select that, select provider, select Microsoft Network, select application gateway, select that, select the year, select the month, select the date, select the hour, select that, and then I get to this JSON file eventually. In which case, if I go to that URL, so maybe if I go generate a SaaS token so that I can access this, so generate a SaaS token for this log file. So if I go ahead and run that, and that's opened up. So if I go ahead, it's downloaded it for me. I'll open it in Visual Studio Code. And you see what this look like. So they are not like fancy logs and stuff like that. So you need to go in to read like a bunch of this information over here. So there you go. You see what that looks like. For example, if I scroll forward, right? You can see what that looks like in terms of maybe there was some detection that were detected. This looked like a SQL injection attack that was detected, and these are the kind of things that you need to go look at, right? It's not something that's like really straightforward, and you need to use another log to like kind of like collect this and to view that information over here. So hopefully that gives you some context. I've run out of time a lot. There's a lot more information that I could go into that unfortunately I'm not able to go into um, for now. But hopefully you've gotten some useful information out of this video. So let me know your thoughts below. So what I'll do again is I'll try to follow this up with more context and more demos and more hands-on with regards to the service later on. But I'll need to stop here for now because the video is getting really long. So thanks very much for watching this video and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.